My name is Alonzo de la Cruz, and I'm the Senior Geomax Engineer at Suncor Energy for all of their upstream program. Before I give away more about myself, I'll give plenty in the presentation. Welcome to Geospatial Data and GeoAI, the coolest data you use. So first, let's jump to some basics. What is geospatial data? Well, it's essentially any time-based data that is related to a specific part of the Earth. That's really all it is. Data that you can relate to a very specific part of the Earth that made sense. It told you something about that physical location at that time. That's what geospatial data. And it comes in all kinds of different formats. The oldest one, probably the most common one, maps. Maps, whether they're on paper, on a computer, doesn't matter what format. That's geospatial data. This particular map we'll talk about later, but yeah, this is a map of the Earth. It just represents the Earth in a specific way at a specific point in time. Tabular, text data. A lot of geospatial data, believe it or not, comes in text form or in tables. You'd be surprised at how much government data, if you download from their websites, comes in text. And really it's because there's something in there that you can use to relate that data to a specific point on the Earth or a location on the Earth. Vector and raster. Believe it or not, this is probably the one you interact with the most. If you're not in the geospatial world, you still probably use some type of mapping application on your phone, like Google Maps, Apple Maps. So when I talk about first vector data, it's those points, on Google Maps where the point tells you, here's this building, or with an address. Or you see the lines. It's a road, a railroad, a path, or an area. You'll see a footprint of a building. Polygons, shapes, that's vector data. Raster are all the pictures, satellite imagery that you often see. That's raster data. And that's probably among the most used in geospatial. 3D models. Now, so far you just saw 2D data, but we live in a 3D world. So 3D models are very common. They come in different formats, but 3D models are another type of geospatial data. And point clouds. This is not a painting, if you might think it looks like that. What it is, it's millions of points all together. Each point just has a three-dimensional coordinate attached to it, and it's just, in the software, it knows where to place it so that you get these point cloud models. That's what that is. And GeoAI is meant to extract information or insights from geospatial data. So we're not talking about generative AI. We're not using AI in this case, the one I'm going to talk about, to create something. Rather, we're going to be using the analytical AI so that we can extract information from the data that we give it. That's what we're talking about when I talk about GeoAI. All right, my history in geospatial. Well, first, I graduated from the University of Calgary in Geomax Engineering a little over 20 years ago. When I went to university, the engineering building didn't look as nice as that. But yeah, about 20 years ago, I graduated from the U of C. So that's my introduction to geospatial. The theory, the application, I got to use some of the text, surveying, some of the science. That's where it started. After I graduated, I got a chance to go teach math in Mexico at a high school there. I taught trigonometry. Trigonometry is one of those basic maths that is part of geospatial. It's actually used, believe it or not, in practical applications. It's not just to torture high school students with, despite what they may say. But yeah, that's the school I taught at. It was in northern Mexico. So I did that for a couple of years. So there's the teaching, some of the math of geospatial. Land surveying. So after that, I went to northern BC. I was working for a company called McElhaney, where I worked as a surveyor, mostly for the oil and gas industry, well sites, pipelines, access roads. This is where I actually got to apply and gather geospatial data. That's an important part of geospatial data. Remember, it's physical, it's representing physical reality. You have to gather it. So that's where I got my introduction to actually gathering that data, learning about the tech, accuracies, all that information. After being in BC for a couple of years, I moved to a smaller consulting company called Martin Newby Consulting here in Alberta, in Calgary, where essentially I was their field crew for about 5 years, but I was also in the office. So here is where I got introduction to the programming part, some of the back-end part of geospatial data. I had to learn SQL. SQL, Python are two very important languages that if you're going to be involved with geospatial data, it's something you want to learn. So that's where I had to learn SQL for the first time. I still gather data in the field now and then, but then I got involved in the processing, the quality assurance, quality control of it, the checking, understanding the accuracies. I started working with satellite imagery for the first time and aerial imagery for the first time when I was here. And after that, I moved to Suncor. I've been there for about a little over 12 years now. And I've been there ever since as their geomax engineer for upstream. Now, I'm going to argue one of the first things is that the digital revolution in geospatial data actually began 70 years ago, believe it or not, with one of the most seminal events in human history, one of the most important events in humanity's entire time on this planet, the launch of Sputnik 1. There is a direct correlation between the launch of Sputnik 1, 1957, to the reams, the just petabytes, all the geospatial data that we have today. And let me explain why. So Sputnik 1 was launched, and it's basically just a satellite transmitter, a radio transmitter, just transmitting a radio signal that anyone in the world could hear. And there just happened to be a couple of scientists at Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Laboratory that listened to the signal. Why did that matter? Because it led to what we call GNSS, Global Navigation Satellite Systems, or what you might just know as GPS. It's much more than GPS now, but yeah. The launching of Sputnik, those two scientists listening to that radio signal eventually led to GPS. Let me explain. So it transmitted a signal that the whole world could receive. The scientists decided to listen to the signal and then see if they could figure out where the satellite was based on the radio transmission. And they could. It was one of the few places that had access to a digital computer. They happened to be the right people at the right place at the right time. So they found that they could actually track Sputnik using the Sputnik's own radio signal. And in the world's greatest Uno reverse card, their boss challenged them to flip it. Use the radio signal to determine their location on the Earth. See, he wanted it for military applications. It was meant to find so that submarines could know where they were. But this was important. Rather than sending an active signal to satellite that could then give away their position, they were going to be a passive receiver. It's one of the brilliant things about GPS is that it's a passive receiver system. And I'll explain. But yeah, they were challenged to figure out a way so that a passive receiver could just receive the signal and then on their own figure out where they were on the Earth. And within a few months, they figured out the basic framework of that. And within 3 years, they launched the first navigation satellite, Transit 1B. This was used early on so that military submarines could figure out where they were on the Earth just by receiving the radio signal. The idea of determining your position on the Earth using satellites was revolutionary. It really was. It was transformational for geospatial, and it fed the growth of geospatial data, or digital geospatial data, because it democratized, it essentially opened to the whole world the ability to get an accurate global coordinate without being an expert in it. Really, as long as you had the machine to receive the signal in the same way that a radio can receive a radio signal, it would tell you where you were. And that idea was transformational. There's a reason why the mapping application on your phone works, because there's a GNSS signal or chip in there to tell you where your phone is with high relative accuracy. And it was so important that the Americans created GPS, the Russians created GLONASS, the Europeans have their own system, Galileo, and the Chinese have Beidou. There's like 100 or so of these satellites all across the world because it's so important. This fueled the growth of digital geospatial data. Without this innovation, we probably don't have anywhere near the amount of digital geospatial data we have today. Without that, GeoAI probably isn't that important. All right, let's look at some of the tech behind geospatial data. Really, it's a mix of these. I'm going to talk about these things: lasers, satellites, drones, and cameras. Vehicles, here we have. Essentially, the whole evolution of the tech behind gathering geospatial data is this. Does it move? I'm going to put a camera and a laser on it. That's really how the tech to gather geospatial data has evolved over the years. Essentially, you use a lasers in active pulse so that you can collect essentially the position of an object. You can get everything about that object. The camera or some kind of passive sensor to receive some part of the EM spectrum. And really, geospatial tech has grown by just putting those laser or a camera on something that moves, on a vehicle that moves. Satellites, of course. There's one of those old Sentinel satellites on the right-hand side. That's kind of what they look like today. But yeah, you can That's a GPS satellite, or sorry, that's a Galileo satellite. You can put a camera on them, of course, to get satellite imagery. To measure distance, believe it or not, see that's a chain. That's how, once upon a time, distances were measured by surveyors. If you've ever flown in and out of Calgary and you've seen kind of the ground or the earth being divided up into squares, was part of something called the Dominion Land Survey. They used chains to measure that. 2 people actually pulled that chain and kept doing that all around to cut up those squares. This was well before, we're talking over a century ago. But then lasers came in. All of a sudden, you didn't need chains. You could use a laser to get a massive amount of a high degree of spatial density, as you could say. All these points with degrees of accuracy that are unheard of, millimeters, sub-millimeter maybe, who knows. But yeah, lasers to measure distances. Cameras in the sky. Cameras have been on planes, balloons, you name it. As soon as they could figure out a way to put a camera in the sky, people did. Those are some old cameras that were once upon a time in planes. Essentially, yeah, you just cut a hole in the bottom of the plane, put a camera on it, GPS somewhere to tell you where it is, and you take pictures of the ground. And finally, drones, remote vehicles. Like I said, it's all about just putting cameras and lasers on something that moves. Whether it's something that goes in the sky, something that goes in the water. But yeah, that's some of the geospatial tech to gather that geospatial data that you see. There is a hard science that underlies geospatial data. When you get into data that's related to some part of the Earth, whether it's geological data, geospatial data, there's often a hard science governing it. And I can tell you from experience, if something is not going right with the data you're trying to figure out, something's just messing up, it's not showing up in the right place, it's often because there's a misunderstanding at some point along the line of the science itself. So I'll just give you some basics. We're not going to spend a lot of time on the science. So first, the Earth is round, but it's kind of more of an oval. Think of it as a slightly deflated beach ball where you press down on the poles, so it's flattened, a little more flatter at the poles, south and north pole, and fatter around the equator. So we create these mathematical models of it. This is called an ellipsoid. There's the Earth, and you can make all kinds of these. This is, some called WGS-84 from 1984. This one's North American data from 1927. You make them to fit that specific part of the world. Yeah, there's hundreds of these. Every region, every country in the world has at least 2 or 3, and they're always adding more because the Earth is dynamic. The tech is getting better, so you can measure the Earth better. So we model the Earth with these. Then we project those onto flat surfaces, which we get these. Flat maps, probably what you're used to, what you've seen. This one's called Mercator. And with all these flat maps, because you're putting a 3-dimensional surface onto a 2D surface, you got to choose what you're going to distort. Size, shape, often both. But that's not the only kind. You can, there's this type of map for the Earth. This one's called Winkle. You can pick a projection to fit a country. This one's called Lambert. It can fit a province, like this one, fits Alberta. Or even, remember this guy from earlier. This projection is called Spillhouse. It's a projection where someone created it from the point of view of a fish. If you look at it, it's centered around Antarctica. And it's essentially how all the oceans of the world are connected. That's what you're seeing right there. So you can manipulate geospatial data in a bunch of ways to make it fit your project. And oftentimes, if something's not showing up in the right place, it's usually because somewhere along the line, there's a misunderstanding of this part. And the science is important because, especially with geospatial data, you want it to show up in the right place. If your data is in the wrong place, inevitably your analysis is going to be flawed, especially if you're using GeoAI. There's kind of a law of geography where everything is related, and the closer things are, the more they're related. So if your data is not showing up in the right place, any analysis you're making of that data is going to be somewhat flawed. All right, now let's look at some actual data. Some actual data from my company. This is a satellite image. At our company, we buy all kinds of imagery throughout the year. Tons of imagery for a lot of reasons. This is a satellite image, one we buy. It has a 50-centimeter pixel. For those of you, in case you're not sure, digital imagery are made up of pixels, essentially squares. In this case, each of those squares represents a 50-centimeter by 50-centimeter area on the Earth. And they're given a color. That's how you get a picture. So this is a satellite, 50-centimeter satellite picture. Pretty good for a satellite image especially, you can see quite a bit. You can pick out a lot of detail in this. We buy a lot of these, get them on a very regular basis. But what if I cared about, say, finding all the warehouses? Something like that. Well, let's take a look at that warehouse. All of a sudden, that 50 centimeter picture that looked pretty good before doesn't look as great now. You start to see the pixelization of it. So the resolution matters at the scale you're working with. But we don't just get satellite images. We also hire a plane with a camera cut out and a hole in the bottom to take pictures for us about once a year. This is what they look like. You can see the dramatic improvement from a 50 centimeter pixel to a 30 centimeter pixel. The improvement is exponential. Also because the size of the data is exponential and always increasing. But yeah, dramatically different. All of a sudden, you start to pick out way more detail about the warehouse. You can get the roof, the sides, you name it, the edges. The vehicles themselves are much clearer. You can start to see in the back of the trucks, all kinds of stuff. But we don't just also fly planes once a year, and we don't just buy satellite images. We fly drones basically every day over our assets. Somewhere over our assets in northern Alberta, there's at least one drone flying, if not multiple. We have thousands of flights a year, and they collect data like this. This is a 2 centimeter pixel. Looks pretty good. I mean, oddly, the improvement isn't as dramatic as before, but still very sharp. Well, what happens if I wanted to, say, find all this stuff like this, like these little tanks behind the warehouse? That same aerial image before, that looked great. You zoom in, and here it starts to pixelize. But that drone image, the exact same one, looks like that. So we use different platforms to get different images, different times of the year for different reasons, depending on the project. But we don't just work in a 2D world. We work in a 3-dimensional world. We need 3-dimensional models. So we get 3-dimensional data of different types, sometimes using the lasers that you saw on a plane. Again, we hire a plane, not just to take pictures, but to shoot a laser at the Earth over our assets at Suncor to give us 3D models, which you'd rather look at like that. Now you're starting to get an idea of what it actually looks like. That's what the actual ground looks like there. And you can start to drape, combine, very common now, marrying different types of geospatial data together to form things like this. So now I draped the drone imagery over the 3D model to get this. Now all of a sudden you get a much better idea. You see the texture of the top of the roof there, of the warehouse. You can kind of feel where the concrete, those parking islands are, et cetera, the tanks. When it comes to the type of GeoAI that we're gonna look at, the analytical type, it only works on data to get you the features that are in the data itself. There's no enhance button. Whatever the data comes in, whatever resolution it comes in, if the features are in it at that resolution, you can use GeoAI to find it. But if it's not, there's probably nothing you can do. You just need data to fit that project. So that's important. That's why scale, resolution, format matter. If I wanted 3-dimensional objects like walls, those pictures, even the drone ones aren't going to help much. If I would need a much larger scale, the drone ones probably aren't that great, but the satellite ones are. So that's why I showed you all this different. I showed you basically different types of geospatial data of the same thing, because they all tell me something different about that same exact physical location on the Earth. GeoAI, where geospatial meets artificial intelligence. Okay, so you've probably seen these graphics before. Within artificial intelligence, what we're actually going to be talking about is this subset, machine learning. Remember, it's not the generative AI. I'm not going to show you generative AI. I'm going to show you analytical AI. That falls under machine learning, and within that, deep learning. So using convolutional neural nets, essentially a higher order of machine learning. And I'm going to show you a couple of projects. One I did and another one another organization did, but 2 real projects. Now, one part of GeoAI is computer vision on geospatial data. That's what these projects are essentially. It's just computer vision on the geospatial data. So think of it, we're training a computer to find something in the data you just saw, those satellite or drone or aerial images, or point clouds, you name it. Yeah, it's machine learning, deep learning. Remember me? the vector data overlaid on the raster data, so those road lines overlaid on that satellite image. One use of GeoAI, and the one I'm going to show you, the projects, is to classify pixels in a raster image so that you can make the vector data. See, before, a long time ago, often to get that vector data, to get those road networks, all that, somebody actually physically had to click on a mouse or a special digitizer and draw those lines themselves from images, from whatever data they had, from maps. And that's how they would make it. It's very time consuming, very expensive, very labor intensive. One of the benefits of GeoAI is that ideally you can feed it all kinds of imagery, and then it would classify everything for you so that you wouldn't need someone to actually physically click on every single thing to make those road networks or to make those footprints. So that's what I'm going to show you. So this was a project where I wanted to figure out a way to determine the true footprint of well pads, these things, for our part of northeastern Alberta, so that we could get an idea of how much space they actually take. In case you're wondering what a well pad is, for a single oil and gas well, you build a well pad for it. Essentially, the wellhead goes somewhere in the middle-ish, and then you cut out an area around it so that you can build it, offsets from trees, that kind of thing. And they come in different sizes, though. But for the most part, they're rectangular, square. They have that shape that you see there. And you have to care about how much space they actually take, the actual footprint. How much wood, how many trees you cut down, or how much space you actually used. And as you can see, it could take, there's these dot Alberta all over the place, and they're not that big. We're talking like, the ones I surveyed in northern BC were like 100 meters by 100 meters, or 120 meters by 120 meters. Some of them are like 45 meters by 65 meters. You don't want to have to go and essentially draw everything yourself to get the areas. What we decided to do was use an external company called Pictera. And they had a deep learning model. Technically, they use something called ResNet 50, which is a convolutional neural network. And what it was is we uploaded aerial data. So remember that 30 centimeter aerial imagery I showed you? We uploaded that. I uploaded 2 years of that, 2023, 2024. And I uploaded all of that to Pictera. And then I would pick training areas. Essentially, you go with a rectangle, you pick an area, and you draw the outlines of the well pads in that training area. So this is the training of the model to find these well pads. I literally, in their platform, I would do the click, click, click. At some point, somebody has to start clicking around so that you can actually tell a computer what is a well pad, what is not a well pad. I would run the model against the imagery, and it would give me something like this. It would find all the well pads. Now, number 4, draw more outlines. As I learned the hard way, when you test the model the first time, you're going to find you missed a lot of stuff. The computer's calling things well pads that make 0 sense. So inevitably, you have to go back and train again. Because no matter how awesome you think your initial training was, I promise you the computer will have a tough time figuring out exactly what you wanted. It wasn't, and I learned, it wasn't just the well pads that I needed to explicitly say in the computer. I needed to say what was not a well pad. It was surprising how many things are actually in a rectangle or square that just aren't well pads, they're other things. So you have to tell the computer, you set a training area where you basically digitize nothing. There's no outlines. Saying all these pixels here, they are not well pads. Stop saying they're well pads. And so you would rebuild, essentially run your model again with that new data until you eventually get to something like this, where it starts drawing almost all the well pads. But with AI, certain things do pop up. There's always going to be false negatives and false positives. Now, false positives, believe it or not, are actually pretty easy to detect and find. As you can see in this case, I could use area. I did set an area filter. I can filter out all these little areas that make no sense, filter them out. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, I set 20 meter by 20 meters, so 400 square meters. Anything smaller than that, gone. They're easy to filter out. But one of the benefits of this platform as well is it told me the confidence of the model. So here you can see some well pads in this, again, aerial imagery. This is from the stuff I uploaded into that Pictera, and it found those well pads. And you can see confidences, 99%, 95%. There's one that says 86%. The model is 86% sure that was a well pad. So confidence is important for AI models. I think it would be fair to argue that it should include everything in AI. It should tell you exactly how confident the computer is that it's right. Luckily, it was only about 5% of what it found, again, those false positives, that had a confidence of 90% or lower. We found anything above 95%, bang on, 90 to 95% for the most part. Anything below 90%, nah, terrible, totally wrong. But great that we had it because we could filter out on that. But yeah, confidence is important. You can see, if some of you look closely, you might be able to see, it actually missed one here. There's kind of a tricky one in there. I know, I'll give you a second. That guy, believe it or not, once upon a time, that was a much clearer well pad. This happens. So there are these instances of what I call edge cases, or so-called false negatives. These are understandable if the computer doesn't pick up these kinds of things. We had certain well pads where to two sides, fully treed, but then two other sides, it was just wide open because there was nothing there in the first place. Can you really blame the computer for not finding those as well pads? So those edge cases do pop up. And those are judgment calls. You have to decide, do I actually care about that? Does that footprint still count? Yeah. And these are the accuracies. So I wanted to test. Luckily, because it's geospatial data, I had independent survey data for the wells. I actually had survey coordinates for the center of all these wells. So I could test the Pictera model against independent data. And because it's geospatial data and it represents a physical location on the Earth, it should all more or less match up. As long as people know what they're doing, no matter what platform, how you're doing it, they should all match up. If it doesn't match up, probably because somebody messed up on that geodesy part there. But so I had independent data to check, and I did check against 463 wells to get an idea. I wanted a good sample. 83%, great. 7% just missed. Who knows why? And there's about 10% of those edge cases, a mix of false positive, false negatives, where you can't, is it really the model's fault? Is it that they just missed it, or did I need to go and refine the training? Things like that. Did they count as footprints? As you saw, there's that one well pad that just, it was right, it was a judgment call. Those things do happen. That's where the confidence helps. Those false positives, that confidence score on a lot of those was quite low. False negatives are tricky because if you don't know that the computer missed something, you just don't know. It's one of those unknown unknowns, and those will really catch you off guard. But that's pretty good, believe it or not. So an external platform like the one we use, Pictera, was great because it allowed us, we had a need to classify large areas, pretty significant areas. We're talking a good chunk of northeastern Alberta to find these well pads. But we didn't necessarily want to build a full infrastructure on it. We had the data, we knew we could train it, but you only have so much time. You have to make choices about what you're going to do, where you're going to spend your time on. So that's where a platform like this was really good. We were able to upload the data. It's really user-friendly. Drawing outlines takes some time, but you didn't have to draw like everything. You draw a certain, small sample size of that. So that's where an external platform like that is really useful, if you have the data and the capital for that, and the need, specifically the need for it. But what about something dynamic, seasonal? Something that changes shape, doesn't have a regular shape. See, the well pads, they're basically all rectangles or squares. It's not going to change throughout the year. It's not even going to change year to year. A well pad, for it to get overgrown, takes years. So it's not really a dynamic thing. What about wetlands? Wetlands are actually quite dynamic. So I'm going to introduce you to a project where they use machine learning to figure out the true location and extents of wetlands, because for conservation, you got to know where things are. You got to know where they are, how they behave, what are the extents. So these are prairie potholes. They dot all over southern Alberta, the prairie region. As you can see, they're wetlands. They get flooded, but the amount of water they have changes throughout the year. The shape changes. There's no uniform prairie pothole shape. They're all different. They all look like that. This is the region that they cover. The prairie pothole region is the green one. This figure is from a paper by the Alberta Biodiversity Monitoring Institute, the ABMI. They are a nonprofit, and they create something called the Alberta Wetlands Index, data that you can download for the whole province. And they decided to try and create the wetland index using open satellite imagery, Sentinel-2 imagery, and open computing source. So not deep learning, but it is machine learning, Google Earth Engine, to try and find all of those wetlands, all the dynamic wetlands in this open imagery. The name of the paper is Creating Digital Wetland Inventory with Sentinel-2 Time Series Data. There we see that time-enabled, geospatial data definition. And Google Earth Engine in the prairie pothole region of Canada. It was published in 2022. The data, the results of this work, you can download. It is there to be downloaded. So what you're looking at here is the second figure from that paper. They're showing you the same small part of the province, just a little square of the province, how it changes throughout 1 year, spring, summer, fall. You can see little wetlands, but they change. They're the size. See, in the spring, they get flooded because snow melts. So they have way more water. Sometimes they dry out, it rains. Their shapes are totally different. So not only are they different from each other, but they vary throughout the year itself. So how did they train their model to deal with this? How do you deal with something that's constantly changing? Well, they used 36 images over a 3-4 year period, 2017, 2020, each taking images from spring, summer, fall, to train the model. So they used Google Earth Engine to group the pixels. So they fed those images into Google Earth Engine, and they said, Google Earth Engine, group together the pixels that are alike. They had all kinds of criteria. If you go to the paper, it's in sections 2.2, 2.4 of the paper. That's where the meat of their methodology. It's pretty good. It's very approachable. So you should read it. And they basically got Google Earth Engine to group all the like pixels together, export it out. Then somebody went and actually classified each of those groupings of pixels as flooded or not flooded. So essentially wetland, not wetland. Then they used that to create a machine learning model called a random forest. They essentially took 5,000 pixels that are classified, created using 50 trees, to create a model that does this. A random forest essentially takes however trees you want to name it, and it lets them decide, based on the data you fed it before, it lets each individual tree make a choice. What is it? Is this pixel flooded or not flooded? And then the majority wins. Whoever has the most votes wins, and that pixel is given that label. And that's what they did. So they fed those 36 images, Google Earth Engine grouped them together, somebody classified them, they fed it back to create the model, and then the model, they applied that to all the imagery covering that prairie pothole region in Alberta, and they exported out classified raster data. So classified satellite images telling you if something's a pixel's flooded or not flooded. Well, yeah, that's a machine learning model called random forest, where basically every tree votes and the majority wins. So here's a satellite image I brought. This is not from their work. This is just one that I had access to of southern Alberta from 2024, summer of 2024. This is their data that you can download today. This is what they got. As you can see, basically fits for the most part. Remember, they're getting at the highest flooded, the highest water level. Let me zoom in a bit more to a different one. You can kind of see the prairie potholes there. This is their data. That's what the model, and they've updated it since then, where they added other types of data to make it even better. But yeah, They create a machine learning model so that it can go through all this imagery to find these wetlands and create an index that can be used by anyone. It's open to everyone, so that they can engage in conservation activities for these things. And it actually proved to be quite accurate. 95% for what's called upland, so that's essentially not wetland, 95% accurate. 70% accurate for wetland, which is considered quite high. If you're wondering why it doesn't match up to 100 or anything, it's because there's just way more upland than there is wetland. That's why. But this was done with open data, with satellite imagery that's nowhere near that resolution, that 50 centimeter image I showed you. It wasn't that. It wasn't anywhere good as that. And they used an open computing platform, not a deep learning platform, just a machine learning platform. So yeah, visit their website, go take a look. The papers on there have other papers, all kinds of stuff that's open for everyone to study and learn from. And there's all kinds of GeoAI data that's open to you. This is a website where government data is collected and it's open. You can go download GeoAI data. You can find data that they used, that they created from GeoAI, buildings, all kinds of roads, you name it. Go to geo.ca. That's pretty easy to remember. And if you don't remember the rest, when inside geo.ca, Google or search GeoAI. And you have data from across the country that you can download and take a look. Their GitHub, it has a link to their GitHub in case you actually want to program. One of the great things about a lot of this data is open. You don't need to have money. You don't need a big corporation to pay for an external platform and buy all kinds of fancy imagery. You can do this with open data and open computing. So one of the benefits, for me especially, for GeoAI is the cost savings, because it reduces a lot of manual tasks. I'm not interested necessarily in generative AI for geospatial because I don't want AI to make data for me. I don't need it to make maps. I don't need it to make what it thinks that part of the Earth looks like. I have data that tells me. What I want it to do is the stuff that takes time or is too expensive. Like, take a look, remember that wetland one? Imagine how costly it would be to send surveyors out to try and survey that. It'd be insanely expensive. That makes no economic sense. You can't do that. It's one of the reasons why. Having someone visit or grabbing all the imagery and having someone click every single outline for one of those makes no economic sense. You can't do that. So GeoAI comes in to let you do those things, as you can see, for either minimal cost, as long as you have the programming ability to figure out Google Earth Engine, or if, saves you a ton of time, like with Pictera, where, yeah, there's a cost there, but what would have taken us months to do took, the model itself takes hours. And this is what the GeoAI essentially does. It classifies. It's essentially, you run the GeoAI on geospatial data so that it can classify objects in that data. It doesn't matter if it's a point cloud, an image, whatever. You need the computer to say, or the model to say, this group of things, this group of points, this group of pixels, this group of whatever represents this. Because then I can quantify. I can get the extents. I can get the total number of things. I can get all kinds. Once I can quantify, I can then get the change. I can measure change. Now you can find patterns if you go with time series data, if you're looking for something over time. And then if you're good enough, or if the data is there, the skills are there, you can extrapolate future change or patterns. And for a successful GeoAI project, have a goal, like a very specific goal. For us, for that one, find well pads. For the ABMI, find prairie potholes. And the supporting data. As you saw, if you can't see it in the data, the computer is not going to find it. If you can't see it in the picture, the computer isn't magically going to find it for you. Geospatial data, I think, is one of the coolest data, and I think it is the coolest data you use for a very specific reason. One of the most important factors in the evolution of humanity has always been to try and find the best, the fastest, the cheapest, the safest way, the more direct way to get people, goods, services to us or us to them. Think about it. The reason GPS, there's GNSS, there's 100 of these satellites, is so that we can often find the best way to get somewhere or for those things to get to us. It's revolutionized travel, logistics, you name it. And in order to do that, you need geospatial data. You need to understand the physical reality of where you are where the thing you want is, and everything in between. And that is why geospatial data, I think, is the coolest data you use. So you can find me there on LinkedIn if you like, but yeah, thanks for attending, everyone. I hope you enjoyed it.